We don't necessarily place a huge amount of value on fathers. That's because they have historically held very different roles within the family unit.
When fathers are portrayed on TV, they're often portrayed as stupid or lazy, but there's very little portrayal of the father who's interested and supportive.
The research has demonstrated for decades the benefits of father involvement. Involved fathers can and do have a really powerful impact in their children's lives, particularly boys. And the important thing, if you go back to the most base level, the fundamental stereotype is that fathers are.
Why do you think the empathy gap exists when it comes to men?
I think it's rooted in how can we triage these things before they get too bad.
So welcome back, listeners. We have a very, very tantalizing and interesting episode today. We're going to be talking about some topics that I think really don't get enough airtime, especially in the context of men. I've got a lot of clients that have really had to deal with various aspects of separation and breakdown and losing their children become estranged from them, their children even being taken away by their mothers unexpectedly. And probably one of the things that has affected a number of men I've spoken to is having their partners, for want of a better phrase, make up stories about them, which cause them to lose their children and them having to kind of prove that those stories are not correct. Well, we're also going to discuss the various aspects and issues that men and boys are facing. And I think it's important to say that men and boys are facing issues, because I think often in the public domain, we talk about men and boys as if they are a problem. And if they just were different, then everything would be different, when actually they are the one experiencing problems, like many of the other demographics and marginalized groups in the world. And today we have a wonderful man who has researched deeply into these topics, right? He's also a professor at West London University of Applied Psychology. Hello, Ben. How are you doing today?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to come on and talk about these important issues.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess the question to start with is, when it comes to kind of the family breakdown, separation, and a court system, why do you think that the men's kind of perspective of things doesn't really get much airtime?
That's a really good question, and that's the question that led me to my work and the project in the first place. Because we've been doing work with. I've done a lot of work with men who are victims of domestic violence, and in that work, a lot of this narrative came up around children, how they were used as vehicles against them. These guys started mentioning family courts, all this kind of thing. And it actually led me off on a personal tangent to think about my experiences of being a child in a really kind of difficult, acrimonious divorce process. And then within that, really actually thinking and examining my dad's perspective, because I'd never really thought about it. Ended up asking him a load of questions and telling him to really tell me the truth, strip back all of this kind of front that he'd put on for so many years and say, actually, what happened? Tell me what happened. And then going on and exploring that with guys in more detail. And I think one of the reasons why maybe I personally hadn't thought about that perspective before, why as society we don't necessarily talk about fathers' perspectives, is because we don't necessarily place a huge amount of value on fathers. And that's because they have historically held very different roles within the family unit. And for a lot of people, that has kind of translated into a stereotype of the kind of removed father, the distant father, the emotionally absent father, the provider father that will just kind of provide for the family and then discipline the kids when the going gets tough, and not much else. And I think the interesting transition that's happening at the moment is that we are seeing a greater level of involvement by fathers, and we are starting to place that expectation on them. But it still sits alongside this general stereotype that dads aren't as valuable, especially not as valuable as mothers. So when you think about family breakdown and you think about relationships collapsing within the family and children not getting to spend time with parents, I think people are a lot less bothered about them not spending time with their fathers because they feel that maybe they bring less value, etc. And I know from a lot of dads that I've spoken to that they feel really trapped in this kind of in-between space where they are involved, or at least they want to be involved. They're aware of these kind of new age stereotypes, but then they get the same kind of short shrift as previous maybe dad generations and aren't valued, especially in the eyes of, say, family courts. So yeah, it's a really kind of powerful mix of all of these different attitudes and stereotypes and kind of long-standing roles that come together to invisibilize that when families break down.
Mm-hmm. This idea is that, you know, we don't really need dads, like they're for the nurturing and raising of children. It's almost like they're kind of reducted into this simplified version of like, well, if they're not absent, that doesn't cause, it can do harm if they're not there. But if they are there, then they're actually not needed other than maybe financially. There's this, you know, really strong kind of prevalence of like them supplying financially, but not necessarily pushed to kind of supply time and even kind of emotional energy towards their children.
Yeah, it's a really, I think we're in a really interesting but also tricky place with how we are approaching kind of fatherhood philosophy, basically how we are philosophizing about dads and their role, how that is going against and sitting against, you know, all of these really long-standing ideas about how nuclear or heterogeneous families operate. Because the research has demonstrated for decades the benefits of father involvement. You know, we have powerhouse academics like Michael Lamb, who's been overseeing the fatherhood literature for several decades now, and powering that forward and showing demonstrably that fathers, involved fathers, can and do have a really powerful impact in their children's lives, particularly boys. And that spans several domains. You know, you look at cognitive development, social development, you know, physical development, that fathers do have this kind of unique role. You have a wonderful amount of work that's been kind of gathering over the last 20 years from Anna Makin at Oxford, where she's actually delved into the biology of fatherhood and showing that fathers undergo biological changes when their children are born as well, whereas previously you think, well, all the biological stuff is contained to mothers because they're the one that carry the babies. But fathers do undergo changes as well, and they have hormonal and neurological responses when they're engaging with their children. So I think there's a lot of kind of information that's coming together that demonstrates that fathers do have a really important role as caregivers. There's a lot of discussion about what the similarities and differences are there between mothers and fathers and the roles that they bring and how they're complementary or not. All of which is adding up to this idea that it is actually, you know, largely worthwhile having fathers in children's lives, but that's not translating necessarily to policy that allows fathers to do that. So we might say to fathers, yeah, you need to be involved. And they turn around and go, well, you're not giving me any paternity leave. So how am I meant to be? And then that translates to then the structures around family breakdown, where you have, you know, very archaic attitudes within the family court that is very much just kind of heavy mother based, saying, look, as long as the children are with their mother, they'll be okay. And sometimes those attitudes coming across in cases where it's demonstrably untrue, of children are actually at greater risk when they're with the mother than they're not with the father. So I think, yeah, we're in a really interesting space. And I'm hoping that projects like my Lost Dads project and the work by Anna, Michael, and all these people are pushing forward this idea that fathers are valuable. And I come at it as all researchers do with lived experience. I'm a father myself, you know, it's the role I prize the most out of any role that I hold in life. My being a father is the most important thing to me. Don't always get it right and very obsessive about getting it wrong and that kind of thing and my failings, but I care about it deeply regardless. And I think a lot of guys do. And when we talk to, you know, fathers who have experienced family breakdown, that's what they say they struggle with the most. It's the loss of that role, you know, in their kids' lives. So, yeah, it's a really interesting time to talk about fathers and fatherhood.
No, it is. And it's quite apt. I've obviously a recent father, 10 months ago, became a father. It still feels quite recent in my life. And, you know, my own journey in that, to come to look at my own fathering that I experienced. And the views that my father took on from his father, a lot of the things, this kind of hereditary fathering we receive of like, they don't need to be around. Like I've even, my dad has 5 children, and I spoke to him a little bit here and there about what he sees his role as in raising children. And he doesn't necessarily see it as like he should be super active. I've heard him say the words, oh, that's for his mother to do. That's a mother's thing to do. And for me, it's been really fascinating to hear him like those ideas. And obviously he got those ideas from his heritage, my family is Jamaican, and how they're not just in fathers. They're in, like you said, the court system, they're in everyone's idea, and it actually flies in the face of the research, what the research shows. So we have this idea of the kind of absent father who's not really bothered, and that seems to be the kind of prevailing idea of fathers, or the kind of, I always say when fathers are portrayed on TV, they're often portrayed as like stupid or lazy, not like highly involved or really wanting to, or the kind of, the sort of, what's it called? I'm thinking of the father who's trying to vicariously live through their child, like maybe their child plays football or stuff like that. But there's very little portrayal of the father who's like emotionally involved in his children, really cares about them, wants to be involved in their lives and interested and supportive and all those sorts of things. There's like a real lack of that shown. And then when it is, then there's some level of ridicule that sometimes men feel. I'm always think of the Daniel Craig being ridiculed by Piers Morgan for carrying his child in the sling.
That well, and I remember being so outraged by it because I wore both of my children for a lot of the time when they were younger. My wife bought a pink wraparound sling, and I was just like, that's our sling. Like we just there's not a part of me that thought I've got to make sure I buy a more manly one to use. And I wore my children, a lot because I wanted to be close to them and I wanted to give my wife a brave and all this kind of thing. So yeah, it's really interesting and how because a lot of that is about vulnerability. And as we know, it's massively against general prevailing hegemonic masculinity stereotypes about how men should be, that they should be stoic and in control of their emotions and closed off. And actually to open yourself up and to love to the extent that parents do their children, I think is a really vulnerable place to kind of open yourself up to as a father, especially. And I think, again, it comes potentially more naturally to mothers, not because it's from them, but because society allows it to come more naturally. There's less judgment there. And I think, it is a really complicated debate because there are so many things that feed into it. You have a lot of biological philosophy around whether mothers do have an inherently stronger bond with their children because they've grown in birth. And there's a lot of biological philosophy around that. And that sits against other, strands of theory, for example, Bowlby's attachment theory that suggests actually, or later versions of it at least, that suggest it doesn't really matter who's caregiving as long as they're doing it well, and that children form attachments with multiple people in their lives. And there isn't anything special about them at the bottom because it's a cognitive thing. So there's lots of different kind of competing narratives about, I had a really interesting debate with someone the other day about whether mothers and fathers can be equated. And I think there's some really interesting research around that because, for example, you have Bowlby's research that says it doesn't matter who kids attach to as long as they're kept safe. And then you also have research that shows, well, actually, mothers and fathers do have different hormonal reactions and children do to them. So there's a really interesting study quite recently that showed that children have a higher oxytocin spike when they cuddle their mothers, and they have a higher oxytocin spike when they are roughhousing with their fathers. And that would suggest a kind of biological, maybe even evolutionary role that mothers and fathers play that is different, and that's okay. And then you get into the debate of why are we so obsessed with these differences anyway? Can't we just all try and just raise the children as best we can? But the point is that the reason we have all these debates is because they play out in very important settings like family court. Because depending on which type of leaning your judge is, if they buy into one philosophy or the other, or one theoretical point or the other, or they just are resting with their own stereotypes, you can get a very different outcome. So yeah, it's really interesting. And just to go back to your earlier point about your heritage and the kind of intergenerational transmission of fatherhood roles, there'll be a huge role of not only, ethnic background and culture, but many other things, class, for example. So, I think there is a very powerful, particularly white working class fatherhood stereotype that is probably very different to a middle class fatherhood stereotype, or stereotypes in ethnic minority households or global majority households, where fatherhood is viewed differently and those roles are viewed differently. So we can then talk about fatherhood in the abstract, but actually you're looking at so many different versions of fatherhood within general fatherhood. That means that your experience will be shaped fundamentally very differently to mine. Because of long-standing stereotypes. We know there is a really powerful stereotype about Black absent fathers. We know that's a really powerful stereotype that's portrayed in the media. That then translates to, for example, that playing out in family core. Those men have even less of a leg to stand on because they're automatically assumed to fit a certain stereotype. And if you then look at the makeup of judges, which are predominantly older white men, who knows what stereotypes they're then carrying into that conversation. And I will stop talking a minute, but one really interesting conversation I had was when I was working with Southeast Asian Muslim men and their experiences of family breakdown, because it really opened my eyes to my own blinkered version of fatherhood and what I was thinking about, because we were talking about family core and they then brought up terrorism accusations. And I thought to myself, wow, I had never even thought about that. And most of the participants I've worked with had been white men. They'd never thought about it or even mentioned it because it's not relevant to them. Whereas when these Southeast Asian and Muslim men are in core and they are fitting potentially a stereotypical visual profile, and the mother is saying, well, actually, they're involved in a terrorist cell, they lose access to their children. And that's a really powerful intersectional point that I hadn't even comprehended. So yeah, lots to consider when we're thinking about what fatherhood looks like and what it looks like in the context of grief.
Yeah, and how I hadn't even thought about that. Like the way in which an accusation can be quite maliciously, well, it is a malicious accusation, placed to use the prejudice and bias of those making the decision, the judges and the court, that would almost trigger them into their own prejudice and even blinker them even more to the person in front. Like, for instance, like you said, the Southeast Asian men being accused of terrorism, being radicalized. Like, oh, he goes to a mosque. That mosque that we know about in X part of London, he goes to that mosque, or his friends go there. Or it could be something along the lines of maybe it's a Black man and you're like, well, he has some friends and they're a bit ghetto and they're from the hood and they do certain things. There's these ways in which manipulation of not just the system, but of the existing prejudice of the judges and those in the court to blinker them against the humanity of the man and actually his desire for fatherhood and being a good father right in front of them.
100%. And because systems are made up of people, and they are made up of people that have been raised in the same society as you and I, and aware of those stereotypes. And I think until you engage with a lot of these systems, it's very easy to blinker yourself and to believe that they are objective decision-making tools. It's like, oh, it's okay, I'll go to family court and there'll be an objective decision made there. Same with any process or system. But they are made up of humans. They're made up of individuals. In the future, who knows? Maybe AI will be making. At the moment, yes, exactly that. You're stood in front of someone who, especially if you have a powerful actor on the other side, who knows what they're doing, can utilize these different stereotypes, and weaponize is the word that we often hear from men, that they're weaponized against them, because it triggers that stereotype and puts it in the mind of the judge that they're this type of individual. And the important thing if you go back to the kind of most base level, the fundamental stereotype is that fathers are less worthwhile anyway. So you're starting the base kind of disadvantage. That's what men describe in the studies we've done, is that they feel that they're going to court, they're going to before judges already with a disadvantage. And then it's about layering on top of that. So if you layer on top of that, it might be from a global majority background, or they might be from a working class background, or things like sexuality. If that has changed or come out within a marriage and then it goes up before the court, there are prejudice around homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia as well that come out. So yeah, there's lots of ways then to weaponize narratives around someone towards a judge, for example, which does happen sadly. And, I just want to use this point to caveat all of this by saying it is not as if mothers get an easy ride in court at all. There are plenty of horrible men out there and fathers out there that are doing the same things back to women. But what we've looked at and we found in our research is that because of that fundamental power differential in terms of parenting, we do see men reporting these invisible experiences in court where they are prejudiced against them and that they have custody allocated in a way that they don't feel is fair, reflective of risk.
Got it. So all killing at a disadvantage. What are some of the kind of invisible emotional experiences that men go through this when they're going through the family court system?
Well, the narrative that we got very strongly from our participant sample, and in our project, we looked at survey responses from 141 fathers, and then we interviewed 30 of them in more detail. And then we also paired that with a systematic review of over 1,000 cases from a charity that supports men in his position. So we kind of pieced all of that together, and we established this narrative of, when the relationship broke down, there was often, or at least 50% of the time, there had been abuse within the relationship. And that was either bidirectional or towards the man. And the men then reported that post-breakdown, almost all of their experiences had involved some kind of manipulation, abuse, coercive control, etc. The interesting thing as well, and this is supported by the statistics from the Office of National Statistics, is that the overwhelming majority of men become what we call the non-resident parent, although that terminology is being phased out. But they're the ones that leave the family home. And what that means is that they automatically get a disconnect from their children, and they automatically get a reduction in their kind of time and the quality of that time, as well as an increase in financial pressure where they're expected to then house themselves and also remain largely in charge of housing the family home as well. So one of the things that really came out in the study was men talking about the financial pressure just being overwhelming of having to pay money back into a family home and the children, which they didn't resent, but some did, but they just, in terms of the home, never the children, but just in terms of it being unmanageable because they then had to house themselves as well. And then it was around how they then established co-parenting, that was very difficult, that it was really difficult for people who are in this hurt emotional space to come together and make rational decisions about childcare. And then obviously if they ended up in court, that being a terrible experience, all of that adding up to horrendous mental health implications, including a really high prevalence of suicide ideation. And the kind of top line statistic we got from the project was out of the 1,000 fathers that we reviewed, 42% said that they had been suicidal in the 12 months prior coming to the service. So almost half had been actively suicidal when they came to the service. So, that is a crisis among separated and forced men. There's no other word for it.
Wow, that's a very high percentage. And then I imagine there's a comparable in comparison to women that are experiencing breakdown there. And I imagine that's much lower.
Yeah, well, because we were father focused in the project, I don't have a kind of directly comparable data set. What we do know, however, is from previous studies, and there was a big meta review that was done a few years ago that showed across a number of studies that divorced and separated men, not necessarily fathers, but divorced and separated men are around 9 times more likely to engage in suicide ideation and completion compared to women.
Wow.
I don't know how that then, if you separated those out into fathers and mothers. But yeah, all we know is, when we look at the support available, it's a really interesting kind of double bind because we don't actually see many specific services that are designed to support women during separation, whereas we do see that with men. And when we speak to those services, they say that they're really underfunded and that there's much greater need. So I don't know whether that's because actually we also need to do some more research on women's experiences of separation. My guess would be is that because you have this dynamic where women remain in the home with the children most of the time, that there potentially isn't as great a risk of that fundamental kind of break, that mental break that fathers maybe experience. And again, it's important at this point to caveat that relationships break down for all manner of reasons. And sometimes that can be because a father is actually, it's right that they are no longer within the home and that they're a risk to the children. And I would never advocate for a father who is at risk to their children to see those children. I think, that's why courts are there, to help maintain and decide those things. And I would also caveat to say that family breakdown is a terrible experience for all family members. I don't want to get that wrong either. What we established in our project was potentially gendered risks that men are potentially exposed to more than women because of the very fact that they are fathers, and that they usually follow this trajectory where they leave the home. They are already facing stereotypes that they're less valued in their children's lives. Crucially, they tend to have less developed social support networks. So they tend to have less people to talk to. And if they do have people to talk to, it tends to not be in as much depth or detail as when women speak with their support networks. So it's kind of this really heady mix, this perfect storm of factors that leave men really isolated, vulnerable, open to suicide ideation. And, from my public advocacy work and being on social media, I've had direct conversations with at least two suicidal fathers, because they've reached out to me because they know my work. One, we managed to get to a support, and one I never heard from again. And I'm not sure what happened. So, it's demonstrable that these stories are out there and these cases are out there. It's a very real lived experience.
Yeah, this is, and it kind of tallies with what a lot I've seen with clients I've worked with directly. The man always moves out the house, which first of all means that his female partner becomes a gatekeeper to his access to his children. And nearly always that in some level becomes weaponized as, like, if he does anything that she is unhappy with, or she has some umbrage with something that happens, that's used as a way to punish him. I've known of clients I've worked with where the woman's disappeared with the children, just disappeared and taken them away, or what's the other really common one? Just continually changing the rules of engagement. So, like, okay, every Thursday, and then suddenly, now I know Thursdays don't work now. Now you need to come on another day, and almost choosing times where he can't find the time to see his children on those days. There's this like constant kind of manipulation and controlling. And I think it's really interesting because it's almost like a bit of a stereotype, isn't it, of women, of like them being controlling and like emotionally manipulative and using the kids against. And often there's almost always some truth in the stereotypes. Would it be correct in saying that some of the stereotypes that we have of men of being violent and angry and possessive are the same things that kind of come out of what they're maybe accused of, either in the relationship or afterwards?
There's an automatic assumption when you hear those types of stories that there's good reason that the mother's doing it.
Mm.
And I, again, would be very clear here. Sometimes there is. And sometimes those behaviors are what we call protective parental gatekeeping, which is where the parent is taking actions to protect a child. And there are absolutely situations like that where a father can come along and disingenuously say, I'm being excluded. Well, actually, no, you're a violent perpetrator, so it's right that you're not in this child's life. It's also important to say that men are very capable of being controlling as well. Now, I've worked with mothers. I've supported mothers. The large project I did was with dads, but I've spoken to separated parents. I've spoken with mothers and fathers who have been manipulated out of their children's lives and been coerced and controlled by a coercive father. So both of those are important caveats. That being said, there are also a number of fathers I've spoken to who have been excluded, or their relationship with their children have been destroyed for absolutely no reason, or for a reason that is related to spousal behavior rather than parental behavior. So, for example, okay, some people mess up, maybe they've cheated in a relationship, okay, and the marriage is broken down. Now, I'm a firm believer, and there's a lot of, again, discussion and philosophy about this. I'm a firm believer in you can, to a point, separate your spousal role and your parent role. So I think it's perfectly okay and acceptable that you might have a father who's messed up in their relationship, has hurt the mother emotionally or been unfaithful. That doesn't mean they're a bad father. And it certainly doesn't mean that they should lose the relationship with their children. And I think that's really what we're speaking about here, is about those men who either, because of an action that they've taken, get this unjustified vitriolic approach to them, where they get excluded from their children's lives, they get attacked, they get stories made up about them, they have their contact controlled. It can also be, not necessarily something that the guy has done at all. It can sometimes be the relationship has broken down because it just has. Sometimes it happens. And what that might do is it might trigger attachment trauma within the mother or within the parents. That then leads them to engage in behaviors that are coercively controlling to protect their attachment system. So, for example, if you think about a classic triangle between a mother and a father and a child, okay? So within a relationship, and healthy, intact relationship, you have all of those relationships operating healthily. Say one of the parts of the triangle breaks down through a relationship breakdown. Now that is a breakdown of attachment between those two adults. What that can then mean is that this person, if they've got attachment issues maybe, would then look to strengthen this bond between them and the child. So what they do is they draw the child to them and they enmesh with that child and they become really overly close with them to the exclusion of the other parent. And that's called triangulation. And the behaviors that are enacted in order to do that are what we categorize as alienating behaviors. So they are specifically designed to break that other bond, to draw the child closer to you and triangulate them to you. So that can happen because of residual trauma, attachment trauma, how they were raised, or just they could have been perfectly well attached to that point, but because the attachment that's broken with their partner has been so destructive and fundamentally shaking their psyche, that they then engage in those behaviors. So there's a lot of reasons why people can engage in these behaviors, some nefarious, some not, some conscious, some unconscious, but it does happen. And I think there are two really powerful stereotypes that undermine people talking about those experiences. The first is this kind of fatherhood, well, we must have done something to deserve it stereotype, which is not the case. The second is a really powerful one, which is, well, parents wouldn't do that because they don't want to damage their kids. They absolutely do. And that's a really powerful and dangerous stereotype. People have such this idea that no way could they possibly do that to their children or want to do that they end up ignoring. So yeah, that's the kind of things that can happen. I've spoken to hundreds of fathers, some mothers, about those experiences happening where their relationship with their children is attacked, it's undermined. I was taken. I was just removed from the family home. My mother disappeared with me, 80, 90 miles away to my grandparents' house without my dad's knowledge. He came home one day. I was gone. All the furniture was gone. My mum was gone. That isn't even an extreme case. We have geographical location that's international and global, where it then becomes very complicated when you're talking about international law and kidnapping. So, it can be very messy, very messy.
Yeah. And how does it impact the children kind of long term?
Whenever I get asked this question, I think the thing I struggle with most is trying to portray the gravity, because I think it's easy to kind of say, well, there was a big review recently out, a few years ago, 2021, by Morales, brought together all of the research on the impact of alienating behaviors specifically on children. There's a wealth of evidence on the impact of divorce generally on children that has gone down into the minutiae of what arrangements work best and is the quality of the relationship rather than the quantity. We have a pretty good understanding of what to do, what the effects are. But I think for me, it's really hard to portray just the significance to that individual child. And I think that's the problem sometimes with academia. It kind of clinicizes and anonymizes it. And that's why I tried to speak about my experiences as a child of divorce, a particularly acrimonious divorce and alienating behaviors, is because I can talk about how profoundly it's impacted me. I was very lucky to be invited to give a TED talk last year about my work in this area, where I talk about those experiences, and it's lifelong. It's a lifelong impact, deep psychological impact around mental health, the way that I view the relationships in my life, the parenting that I then engage in, or sometimes can't, or feel traumatized by, all of these kind of things. And the impact it had on those relationships moving forward. I've done a lot of work, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, with my dad, rebuilding that relationship. And we're very close now, much closer than we were for several years, because of everything that I had been made to believe about it. And so, if you want to go by the literature, then you're talking, social impact, cognitive impact, emotional impact. With the alienating behaviors, I think that can be most impactful and dangerous, because what you're doing is you're attacking an attachment system, and that's very disruptive to a child's kind of psychology and understanding of the world, because you're basically pulling the carpet out from under them and saying, everything you believed about safety, about how you can go about the world, is actually not true, because that person that we said was safe isn't safe. So that's immensely powerful. So it kind of depends on lots of different factors. But what I would say is there is no such thing as a good divorce for children, other than when you're tipping over into, if the relationship was so bad and toxic when it was intact, it can actually be beneficial when the partners come away. But it still represents a routine change. It still represents a difference and a change in the child's understanding of their parents' relationship, etc. So it has a huge impact on children, and there are lots of things we can do to mitigate that. So there's lots of clear advice around how you manage that, how you keep implementing a routine, open communication, providing it's safe to do so. The evidence suggests that shared physical custody is better for children, and that it kind of that they can handle having to go to different houses as long as the communication's good. So there's lots we can do about it, but there is a huge amount of impact, wide-ranging impact, depending on what's involved.
Yeah, it's it's quite close to home, because it's things I've seen in my family system, in my friends of friends, friends of the family. And there was the particular sentence he said that really kind of hit me was, the things you were made to believe about your father. This common thing that I speak to the men that I work with, who, again, they had absent fathers, is usually the story. They have absent fathers. They were told that father was a particular type of way, and that's the reason he's not in your life. And then later they had a relationship with that man and came to realize that wasn't true. And I've seen how destabilizing that is for a man, an older man, not an older man, an adult man, who realizes, because it creates almost like two problems, because they're like, wait, I was lied to.
Yeah.
And I can't trust my mother now as a human being, as a person, because the picture she gave me of this person isn't the picture I'm experiencing or what is true. And then there's also this piece that commonly comes up is around self-trust, because the one person in their life they feel they could trust, or the people they thought they could trust, they realize that, I can't trust this person. So who can I really trust? And I see it's this very destabilizing piece around it. It really hits men that I've worked with, where they're like, I can't trust my decisions. I can't trust my choices. I can't trust my cognitive abilities to make sense of the things in front of me, because I was wrong this time, or it turned out that I was told like incorrect information, I was lied to.
And that's the attachment break. Attachment is not just about loving someone. Attachment is about understanding. If we really want to get into it, attachment is about understanding that you are safe. Human infants are born with very few capabilities, as we know. And that's a evolutionary trade-off for bigger head size. So, we can't stay in the womb to develop fully because we'd be too big to be birthed. So the trade-off is that we're birthed early, and that means we depend on our caregivers to a much greater extent than pretty much any other mammal. You go to the zoo, watch a giraffe being birthed, a couple of hours, they're up and about and they're happy as well. With children, as you are experiencing yourself right now, and as I've experienced and continue to experience, they need a lot of our time and they need a lot of our care. And what that means is that they're looking at you to understand, where is my anchor? Where can I always come back to? What keeps me safe? What's my reference point for me to then go and explore and figure out this crazy world we live in? So when you attack that, you're basically untethering a child. And it doesn't, it does matter when it happens, but it can be really powerful if you untether that child in adulthood and they are then an adult. Because what they're doing is they're basically then looking at their really ancient anchor that they've had for years and years, and it's being pulled out of the ground. And they think, oh my God. And luckily, they then have the adult brain to process and rationalize that. So that's the positive. But on the negative side, they think, God, this thing I believed for so long has been disrupted. So basically, it's always a real challenge for any individual to negotiate an attachment disruption. For children, it's a challenge because they've only just formulated it, or they're in the process of formulating it and it's being disrupted. For adults, it's a challenge because it's something they believe for so long and then it gets disrupted. So I can completely understand, and I went through this. I had a really tough time that the work triggered, where I had to go to colleagues and my boss and people and just say, I know this sounds crazy, but this study I've just done has kind of messed me up a little bit, and I need to go away and I need to actually do some. And I ended up turning it into an auto-ethnographic piece where I wrote a chapter with my dad to explore our experiences. But it involved me, sitting down with my dad a couple of days before Christmas a few years ago and saying, you need to tell me your side of the story now. And it blowing my tiny brain apart, because I was undoing what I believe to be well-established law, family law, about what I'd been brought up with and why my parents' relationship break down. All of these things where my dad was saying, look, I think you're ready and you're asking me is the truth, obviously his version of the truth. Then I had a whole crisis going, well, okay, now I've got two versions of the truth. Who do I choose to believe? And that then triggered me back to loyalty conflict that I had when I was 6 years old, stood there going, who do I want to live with? The social workers are asking me who I want to live with. And that's what the men you're speaking about are experiencing, is that loyalty conflict. Even all those years later, when they're grown men, being presented with a different narrative and going, well, how now do I look my mum in the eye? Or was what she was saying actually the truth and I'm being hoodwinked again? It just invites these destabilizing thoughts. And that can be really hard to manage. And obviously for children, it's extremely difficult because they don't have the capacity to manage it. And that's why they end up suffering all of these really negative mental health outcomes. But for adults, it can be really tricky.
Mm. And how did you reconcile the loyalty conflict yourself?
We're slightly different for me because my mum actually passed away when I was 18. So I wasn't bouncing around between two active narratives. I had a narrative that I'd been read and I'd kept with me since when she passed away, and then a new narrative. And I had to kind of make the decision of, well, my dad's here now. I believe him as I'm sat here now, and he's great with my kids, and I wanted to have a relationship with my kids, even if ours was damaged. So that's what I'm going to go with. And I do believe him. I did believe him when he was telling me his side of the story. Especially because of the work that I then have done with other fathers, where I go, this is basically my dad. I see it plain and simple in front of me. My dad's a very gentle, sensitive person. I can't see him doing half the things that I was told he was doing. So that, combined with the work that I did, which was very kind of cathartic in that way, and it was amazing to be able to weave as a reflective researcher my positioning into that research. And then I did have a lot of help, clinical help, a lot of private kind of therapy, talking through these issues with a therapist, really getting to the bottom of things and using it hopefully as an opportunity to grow as an individual, but as a parent as well, because it has had an impact on how I have approached my children in the past. For example, I've had issues, recognizing that they need love in certain circumstances because I lacked love in certain circumstances. We do tend to repeat certain patterns unless we are A, reflective, and B, lucky enough we know to people who are able to steer us, and which I'm very fortunate to have. Someone to take you aside and go, there's something going on here. Maybe we should unpack it. But yeah, so it was a combination of lots of different things to kind of delve down and reconcile. And now what I'm really interested in is this next stage of work where I want to try and, as much as possible, channel energies into how can we triage these things before they get too bad? How do we stop people getting into the family court system in the first place? How do we stop these behaviors before they occur? How do we educate and change this societal narrative around separation and divorce, and that it's acceptable to chat about your partner in front of children? How do we challenge all of these kind of embedded stereotypes around fathers, mothers, divorce, separation? Because I think societally we do tend to allow quite a lot of negative behaviors when people are getting separated, and we aren't necessarily very good at focusing and orienting it on children. I know some people that have done it very well. So that's my next kind of phase of work is how do we improve that?
I guess people become very selfish. When we get into heightened emotional states and stress,
and entrenched is so people, and especially when they get into family court, it is inherently adversarial. So you're not really going there. Well, you might be going there to try and reconcile and get the best outcome, but often the system, the rules you're a part and exaggerates those differences. And, it's genuinely not as bad here as in other countries where you might have a lawyer in your ear going, sure, you don't want to do this. Why don't we go for this? And I think that is also exaggerated by the fact that you're dealing with people who are hurting. They're not in a position to have those rational conversations. When I'm upset, when you're upset, do you find it easy to calm down and make a rational decision? No. And if you've got someone whose relationship has broken down for whatever reason, they're still going to be upset. They're going to be hurt. So then if someone says, could we by any chance swap weekends because it's my birthday? Well, yeah, okay, you might think, no, screw you, I don't want to do that. And so often that can override, actually, what's best for my child? Would they actually benefit from swapping the weekends, etc.? And actually, I've worked on, with a wonderful charity called 1+1, I've been working on for about 18 months now, an app called Separating Better, which we've launched in England at the moment, which is being recommended by local authorities, where parents download the app and it first addresses their emotional readiness. It does an intervention with them to assess their emotional readiness and improve it to say, what are the things you need to work through before you try and sit down with this person and do a parenting plan? And we've seen it's really effective. It's helping people get into that position when they can then decide who gets Christmas Day.
And gets in those, stops them from bringing all their emotional stuff, their anger, their frustration, and using that as you said, use the word before, is like weaponizing that against the other person, using the child to do that. That's fantastic. Fantastic. Because a common question I've had from people before is like, how do we do it? And then the co-parenting piece, of you mentioned before, it being so difficult when there's so much emotional charge involved. And yeah, so that's fantastic. There's a resource there. I definitely add that into the show notes because I think there's a few of my current and former clients that could do with that.
Yeah, and it's really good as well because it allows this platform for each individual to go in and populate a parenting plan without necessarily having to sit down and chat it out. They can kind of populate it at a distance, which for some people is both more effective and safer. So we're hoping it'd be a really useful resource. So I'll send you some notes to add in the blurb. But that's what I'm kind of focused on is how do we take these people that are at the point of that separation? Because people are always going to separate. It's not about, the philosophy is not about keeping people together at all costs, because like I said, sometimes it's actually right for people to separate. It's not working. And and relationships break down for all variety of reasons. What we want to do is we want to try and create a system, society, resources, everything we can throw at it, that at that moment we can triage. We can go in and we can say, and this is the Scandinavian model, a lot of Scandinavian countries have this, where immediately you know where to go, whether that's a physical place or online, to say, okay, my relationship's breaking down. What do I do next? Because at the moment, a lot of people's automatic assumption is, okay, well, I think we're going to need to go to court. We need a child arrangements order. And that's not advisable, because as we know from lots of testimony, as soon as people go into that system, it grabs them, it churns them up, spits them out, often in a worse position. And of course, the trick, the difficulty there is that courts are getting clogged up, so they can't actually deal with the cases that need to go to court. Because there are some. There are some that are very complicated or acrimonious or involve an abusive partner. They need to be in court and it needs to have an adjudication. But at the moment, we're getting clogged up with a lot of kind of, that he did this or she cheated on me, so I can't do, which we could actually triage earlier on, get your emotional readiness there, focus you on the children and say, right, what is the best arrangement for the children? That's what we're trying to do now.
Fantastic. Getting the parents to do the work so they don't offload that onto that
exactly.
kind of bi-directional relationship.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I love that. That's amazing. Really beautiful work. I thought we'd change direction a little bit and talk about something we were mentioned earlier on, is around the kind of issues and challenges that boys and men face. I do a little bit of work in schools. I've been into a number of schools and talked, and there seemed to and this was a few years ago, there seemed to be a very prevailing feeling that I experienced from some teachers even, that the problem of the boys are not enough like the girls. The girls are good. They sit down, they listen, they're studious, they work hard. I was even having a conversation with my sister's a primary school teacher. We were talking about this as well. Girls, they sit down and they work hard and they're studious and they do all that really nice girl stuff. And the boys are a problem because they don't act like that. They don't act well. Their behavior's poor. They're violent. And there seems to be the prevailing narrative, and also the prevailing narrative to some degree about men publicly. Men are a problem. If the men were just not here, the world would be a better place. I often feel that, and I've been in spaces where it's almost virtually said / joked about. Why is that incorrect?
Because we're all human. We're all men are humans too, and they have been raised in a system that nobody is arguing isn't broken, that has been defined by a prevailing powerful class of men, often to the detriment of many other men and women. So we're in this position where men are viewed as the problem rather than having problems, and that can be really dangerous because we're just really overruling, ignoring, not thinking about their needs in the same way that we would do if we're talking about women's issues. And it's interesting you say about the school thing, because I think the thing I always say about school is we don't necessarily think about the structures, we're thinking about the individuals. And you wouldn't turn around and say to a person in a wheelchair, why can't you get into this building? That's a you problem. We would change the building, and we've moved with disability, for example. We have moved, or we're starting to halfway there, kind of, I don't know, and others will be able to be more accurate. But we have at least started to have this narrative of a social model of disability rather than a medical model. So rather than saying, well, you're disabled, we're saying, or differently abled, we're saying, what can we change as a society in order to accommodate? Why aren't we having that same conversation about schools, for example? So we have this, and I'm a school governor at my local school. We have this conversation a lot. I say, is it that boys aren't right for school, or is it that school isn't right for boys? And it's all very well and good saying, well, boys are just not acting right. They're not sitting down. Or whether it's socially raised or whether it's biological or a mix of the two, we know from the statistics that boys tend to be more active. They don't like sitting down as much. On average, this is as a generalization. Obviously, you have some very active girls and very passive boys, but generally, So why are we then trying to force them to sit down in a classroom for 6 hours a day? Why are we not trying to engage with this real active outdoor curriculum, for example? Why are we not taking more philosophies from other countries about how learning occurs best and when it's free and when it's about experiences? So that's the thing that annoys me, particularly about the education debate, is that we automatically gravitate towards boys and their behavior rather than looking at our systems and how do we change our systems in order to make boys feel, and some girls and children more generally, I would argue, feel more comfortable and less bored in a school setting. And that's exactly the type of debate that you have in so many different kind of arenas where we say, well, men are violent. Why are they violent? Men are, they just end up in prisons because that's where they're meant to be. Is the prison population 80 or 85 or 90% now? You know, men are 80% of the homeless population. No one cares. No one views that as a gendered issue. It's just, you see any charity, it's just we deal with homeless individuals. So why isn't it gendered? If it was women who were 80% homeless, it would be a really gendered issue. So the argument I made in my book is that we need to just open up all of these conversations. We need to just start talking about these things because first of all, a lot of them are overlooked. We don't even know they're a problem. And then if we do think they're a problem, they're not looked at through a gendered lens. Or if they are, it's this weird gender inversion where a lot of the initiatives I have seen are around how do we help women in prisons and how do we help female homeless. I'm like, yeah, but obviously that's valid, but they're not the majority. So it's this weird kind of if there is a gendered focus, it's kind of inverted. So I think that's what I tried to do in my book is I've tried to systematically go through, okay, what are every and all of the issues that may affect men and boys, either by majority participation or in a gendered way, and what can we do about them, and what do we need to be talking about? So that's what we're facing with at the moment. But I think my final point on this, not that we should have to make this argument, but there is also a powerful argument, is that no gender equality and progression can occur unless you have all the participants involved in the discussion. So a lot of these issues that we're talking about, especially when you look at men violence, for example, you have to think about the conversation more deeply with men in order to help women. Because at the moment, we're viewing it as a gendered issue. Okay, women are the majority participant victims. Our only response to that at the moment is, well, men are just horrible. Men are just violent. How is that going to help anything? That's not going to progress anything. I've got wonderful researchers like Jenny Mackay at Nottingham Trent who are actually asking the questions of what are the life trajectories of these men? What have they been through in childhood that might inform their perpetration? Oh, and surprise, surprise, they actually have very similar life trajectories to female abusers. So maybe it's more of a human response, but it's just that men are more exposed. So that's just what we need is more questioning. Why are men suffering or issues with these particular problems? And not just making it a characterological flaw.
And the question kept screaming out to me as you were talking. I mean, you said that, we don't, if it's affecting men and boys, we don't look at it from a kind of gender issue, from a gendered lens. But if this is an issue that's affecting women, we really put attention on it. Like, for instance, often we talked about the kind of huge amounts of violence against women, which is happening. I'm not denying that. But that, from my understanding, that men are actually the victims of violence in larger numbers than women, but it's just men causing violence against men. So we kind of almost negate that. It's like, well, if men are hurting men, it becomes zero.
Absolutely. And I have a big chapter on violence in my book. And when we talk about violence, a lot of people gravitate towards the domestic abuse space, which is where there's about a kind of 60-40 split, female to male in terms of visual reporting violence and etc. But actually, you're absolutely right. When you take that as a broader issue of violence en masse, yes, men are absolutely the majority of participants of homicide, suicide, gang violence, all of these different types of violence. But like you say, because it's often male on male, people are just going, well, it's just kind of some zero. We'll just kind of leave them to it. But I think there is a huge amount of work to do on why that's occurring, why that's happening. How do we reach men at a younger age to engage in preventative practices? And also, I think there's a bigger philosophical question that we have to ask ourselves of why haven't we cared previously? Why don't we care? Why is there an empathy gap when we're talking about men and men's issues? Is it part of our stereotypes being internalized where we think that men are almost subhuman, are almost
Mm.
dehumanized in the sense that they don't have the same needs, thoughts, complexities as women because inherently they are men and because we've told them never to show us those complexities and said they need to be closed off. I think there's a much broader question that, again, the book invites of saying we have to approach this with the fundamental understanding that men are human. If we don't do that, then there's no point having any of these conversations. And if you're just going to go, well, men are just violent because they are, then we're never going to get anywhere. If we start asking the questions of why boys don't sit still in school, why boys engage in gang violence, why they are the majority homeless population, why they educationally underachieve, I've already said school, why they're more susceptible to gaming and screen time and pornography addiction. If we don't ask all of these questions, we can't tackle all of them to the benefit of both men and broader society.
Mm. And why this is super interesting to me, how you put it there, is because I guess from my lens of, being growing up in the 90s, I was born in the 80s, growing up in the 90s, and I saw a very prevailing idea about black men in particular, of black men being violent. I felt like it was on the news, it was on the TV, it was in the TV shows, it was in films, and it wasn't really questioned. It was just like, this is how it is. And this, for those of you listening, there's a long history of this that goes way back to the days of slavery and pre-slavery and all sorts, right? The savagery of Africans and so forth. But it's only really, it feels like in the last, maybe, I guess after the 90s and maybe the last kind of 15, 20 years, that the questions are being asked of why. I guess even post George Floyd, that was what kind of really, one of the things that really came up was like, oh, well, why is this the case? Like, why are we subjugating black people to violence? For the, not for the first time, it's happened before, but this is when it really got into the public domain. People are like, oh, well, I have these ideas, but why do I have these ideas? Why is this happening to these people? And I feel like we're kind of in that beginning of that inquiry about men, of like, oh, well, they are this way. They're just this way. That's nothing we can do. But now people are starting to ask why. Like, what's happening to men and boys that means that they're violent? What's happening to men and boys that means they're struggling at school? But I see it as like with many social changes, it takes decades. It takes generations even. Like we were talking about fathering before, you said the research has been there for 20, 30, 40 years. And it's only now that we're starting to see that there's a kind of change in how we view that. But I guess the question I wanted to ask is, I imagine some of those questions around why that you've started to see the answers to. So I'd love to hear what some of those are.
Yeah, I mean, I cover this in the book with a kind of summarizing chapter at the end. I mean, there's two important chapters at the end of the book that are relevant to what you're saying. So the first is I thread intersectionality throughout the book, but then I end on one of the two chapters is really kind of drilling down and saying, look, all men, once we started having these conversations about men generally, we then need to acknowledge that there are hundreds and thousands of different types of men, and they will have those different kind of conversations, like you said, around black men, for example. And I've done a lot of work with LGBT community and LGBT survivors of domestic violence, and you see the same thing there, whereas you have the baseline issues with men, and then you layer on top of that LGBT issues, and you get the more exaggerated effect. So there's a whole kind of chapter there talking about that. But then crucially, I end the book saying, look, if you want to work with men or inquire about men or provide a service for men or talk to men, there are some principles that you need to operate by. And those have kind of really focused around, there are 6, but I can't always remember them off the top of my head. But, it's things like being genuinely gender inclusive. And what that means is bringing men into the conversation to help them inform whatever you're delivering, for example, and actually shaping it around their needs. For example, we saw this big shift a couple of years ago in the domestic violence sector, for example, where a number of charities, existing charities, were bolting on a male provision to their existing service, which is all very well and good, but men weren't using them because it wasn't actually tailored to them. So it's things like being genuinely gender inclusive, working together across different multiple partnerships, getting lots of different kind of opinions and voices around it, making sure that we're reaching men in their spaces, for example. So, largely it's less effective to go and put domestic violence ads, well, not ads, leaflets, domestic violence support leaflets targeted at men in GP surgery. Why? Because men are terrible at going to the doctor. So why don't we instead put them in football stadium toilets where we know they go? So it's those types of principles at the end of the book that really draw together and saying, okay, largely this book was about starting a conversation. I don't have all the answers, but if you're someone reading this book and you are interested in these issues and you're doing something for men or you want to, here are the principles that you need to operate by in order to make that effective. And so hopefully that's a really kind of powerful tool for people to use. But I think to kind of answer your question more broadly of what do we need to do, like I said before, talk like we're doing now, like getting into these issues in more detail rather than just being instantly dismissed, like the school issue saying, well, boys are just a nightmare to teach. I've heard that before. I've had that conversation. And I would always challenge, especially because of what I do, I would always challenge that and say, why? We don't just leave a group to fend for themselves in any other situation. Like I said, you wouldn't just say to a disabled person that can't get into a building, well, tough luck. We would think about how we adapt that system and how we respond to their needs. And I would say the argument is similar for boys, whether it's in education or different areas. So I think we need to have, and it's difficult at points because it is hard sometimes to look at men as a social group and a social class and be positive. Because some of the things that we see happen en masse and in different spaces. And I totally get that. But unless we do, we won't get anywhere with that social class. So it's kind of the ball's in everyone's court to agree that this is something that you want to do, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm met with that a lot, even when I talk about men or I've been talking about men having issues for years. And usually met with like, men just need to sort their shit out. Men needs to level up. And I work in the space of relationship a lot. Men just need to level up. And I also always think it's interesting. It's like men made the world like this. So it's.
Well, I hate that argument because men, I would always argue against this idea because this feeds off an idea called universal privilege. So this is the idea that all men are more privileged than all women in any given situation. And it's just fundamentally not the case because intersectionality plays a role. And so I would argue that it's been a very small elite ruling group of men that have built and shaped a system. And everyone has been left to suffer. And yes, there are different arguments about how men in other layers and levels of this system reinforce that. And I'm not saying we don't, but then so do some women. Some women rely heavily on those stereotypes. And, for example, there's some really interesting dialogue about at the moment about what women look for in mate selection and dating. And actually, you see some of those stereotypes being reinforced by women themselves saying, well, I actually want a man that will provide for me. I want a man that's strong. So it's not just men and it's not just the men's problem to solve either. Like we have to come together and think, okay, even if a smaller group of a ruling class of men have created this system, we all need to be participants in thinking about how we challenge that system. Because again, if you buy into this idea of universal privilege and power, the argument is that, well, men will never want to engage in the conversation because it means them giving up their power. For most men, they don't feel very powered or powerful. A lot of us feel extremely restricted by that system as well. We would love to fight against it. And, I have done things that I view as fighting against it as a man where I have always made the commitment to go to my kids' baby groups, even if I'm the only one, because I love them. I want to spend time with them and I just do it as a human rather than a father. But it's amazing how many judgmental looks you sometimes get from mothers. Being like, why? Like, so I understand a lot of that thinking and I understand the frustration, and I get it, and I watch the news just like everybody else, and sometimes I think, oh my God, we are awful. But I also then think we have to be having these conversations because it's not everyone all of the time. It's not masculinity, it's not men, it's a human problem. So you like to approach it as well.
Yeah, I deeply agree with you. Yeah, because the idea, always, men create that system. It's like in the same way I've had that said to me, and I always point out, it's like, I wasn't even alive building this system, right? And I'm, or I say my favorite argument is like Hillary Clinton has far more invested in upholding the system as it is in comparison to me. It's very easy to pick out Elon Musk as the most toxic man alive, but don't forget that there are women who are supporting him and holding him up. The 14 baby mothers he had, for example, holding him in place.
It's that again is the part about intersectionality, because when you look at concentrations of, I won't give any specific examples because I don't want to be libelous, but there are different layers and there are different structures within that border power structure. It just isn't as simple as saying, well, men are privileged and women are not. And so the more that we kind of grapple and accept this idea, this multi-layered complex structure in which we live, the more that we can actually open up space for those conversations that I think will make much more an impact than simply saying all men are bad, hashtag kill all men, I've seen on Twitter several times, or X as it. So yeah, that's what we need to do.
Yeah. And I guess the final question is something you mentioned before, and it kind of links into this, is the empathy gap when it comes to men. There's this real empathy gap. And I guess I see, and I'll voice my opinion first, is like, it's almost like because we both teach men not really to have empathy by the way that we raise boys, and we remove them from emotions from a young age. But then we also reinforce that by not having empathy for them as well, which is this really weird way in which if someone has empathy for you, I found in my work, working with men, it's one of the ways in which we can develop empathy for others because we get modeled it. But if we are seeing a world where no one has empathy for us, we're like, why should I have empathy for other people? And this empathy gap goes. But I guess the question I have is, why do you think the empathy gap exists when it comes to men?
I think it's rooted in those long-standing ancient stereotypes that men, because we are tough and strong and independent and assertive and unemotional, that we just don't have those needs. And I think it's that stereotype that is so powerful of really stripping us from a very young age of the complexity of human emotion and the accessibility to those emotions and to life. I genuinely think it, when we see this in the literature and in lived experience, it happens very early, where boys are targeted to close themselves down. And that's what they do. So it's then no wonder that we sometimes reinforce those stereotypes of not thinking that other men in our lives have those needs and not reinforcing them. And I have to catch myself with my two. I have one of each. So I have to catch myself to make sure that I am opening myself up and giving that kind of deep, rich, emotional narrative and dialogue to my son that I give to my daughter. And it's interesting because even me, who is so immersed in the philosophy of all of this, I still catch myself being more cuddly, more tentative, more protective of my daughter because she's a girl. It just, obviously in something subconsciously in my mind, I have to catch myself and go, no, treat them the same. And so it's, again, like you said, it's kind of no wonder that you have generation upon generation of men being raised where basically their only outlet emotion is anger. That's the only one that gets kind of reserved for us. And then we turn around and go, oh, seems like men are really violent. And they end up in really bad situations and they're really closed off. Oh, who knew? I wonder where that's come from. And I go, well, we know exactly where it comes from. It comes from a blend probably of some maybe baseline biological differences coupled with a huge injection of social pressure to act in exactly that way. So it's a challenge. It's a massive thing. Like you said, social change and stereotype change comes over decades, but I'm really happy to be invited on to talk about things like this because, these types of discussions didn't even occur like 10 years ago properly in terms of wider social media and social reach. So, no, it's been really great to talk. And that's what a kind of my aim was for the book, is to open up these conversations and to really have people think about the men in their lives, because that's often where people maybe sometimes cut through, is that they think, well, and that's what I say to people, is they think of your father and your brother and your son and your dad, all this kind of thing. Do you not think they have a richer human experience as you do? Of course they do. But if you can apply it to them, apply it to someone else, it's very easy to dehumanize a 14-year-old black boy in a balaclava. It's very easy to dehumanize a human child that is engaging in that behavior, probably for a very specific reason with a very complicated and traumatic background. So why don't we care more?
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Ben, thank you. It's been such a engaging and riveting conversation for me to talk about these issues of men in the separation and court system, and men and boys as a whole, and the way in which the way we socialize men, the way we view men impacts them in the systems, the school system, the court system, the separation system, whatever, and how it really negatively impacts them. And this kind of flies in the face of this, like, oh, well, it must be their behavior. This kind of always, and I'm not raising another point, but just what I've taken from what we talked about, is this, it must be something that they're doing that's creating this thing, instead of it is the system at large that's causing them to be a certain way. And I reiterate this again and again with people, that, we are all in this system, or the various systems that shape us, right? And we're all disadvantaged in some ways. Even the most privileged of person you see is living some level of disadvantage from the system that we are in. And sometimes some people experience more or less. But I want to say a big thank you for today's conversation. It's been really, like I said, it's been really enjoyable for me. Listeners, if you've enjoyed this conversation, which I'm sure you very much have by this point, this is a beautiful conversation to share with a man in your life, or someone who could really do with this bit of information, or to allow themselves to be seen differently. Or there's someone who's dealing with separation, and they could really do with realizing that they're not alone, that there's ways that can help them, and as with the app that Ben is building, has built. So I deeply ask you to share the love, as I often say. But thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next week. And again, another thank you to Ben.
Thank you.